In this, our sixth lecture, we continue our exploration of life lessons from the great books and our theme of the unconquerable human spirit. That is, of those individuals who have not only survived adversity, but risen above it to create enduring testimonies to the human spirit. The terrible suffering of Elie Wiesel in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, the death of 6 million people for being just what they were, for no crime whatsoever, were all part of the 20th century and its technology. To those who lived into their mid-years through both World War I and World War II, this seemed an appalling betrayal of all that they had been raised about, all the values that they had imbibed in their youth. Because Europe, down until 1914, from about 1870 to 1914, believed that it was living in a great new millennium, an era of peace and progress and prosperity. In fact, you could have brought a professor here in May of 1914 to lecture, and that professor might very well have told you that Europe would never see another great war. That technology was so far advanced, communication was so far advanced, the telegraph, for example, that there would never be misunderstandings between nations that couldn't be cured very, very quickly. That moreover, the global community was drawn together by big business. And we really lived in a global economy, a global marketplace, and the business world would never allow another great European war. Moreover, we were just too civilized to go to war like that again. And finally, technology had made war so terrible that it could never be undertaken. The losses would just be too terrifying. Yet, in fact, within a couple of months, the summer of 1914, Europe would find itself enmeshed in the greatest war in history. And when it was over, more than 4 years later, 11 million men were dead, and millions more dead of the disease that came in the destruction of war. And a whole civilization seems to have collapsed. And instead of preventing war, technology just made it more awful. The great cannons, the poison gas. And instead of learning its lesson, barely 20 years later, Europe went to war again. And this time, 50 million would die in the course of that war. And out of it would come the atomic bomb and the threat of the destruction of the whole world. Well, one man who lived through this, who failed to be crushed by all the terror of war, was Albert Schweitzer. Now, 50 years ago, he was a household word. But now I ask my class about it, and not one of an intelligent group of students will raise their hand to having heard of him. He was born in 1875 in Alsace. It was then part of the German Reich. It had been taken from France in the 1870 war between France and Germany, and so he was born a citizen of the Imperial Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm. But the Alsatians are their own distinct people. They still are. Their language is basically German. It's a Germanic dialect. But they have their own ways, and they think of themselves as neither French nor German, though they do like to say that they eat as much as the Germans and as well as the French. And it's a people that likes to be alone, cultivating its vineyards with a sort of solid character to them. He was born there. His father was a Protestant minister in a small village, and Schweitzer said he was really bilingual, but he also believed that nobody was truly bilingual. His real first language was Alsatian, then he learned German, and then he became very fluent in French, but he always, when he wrote it, it was clearly a second language to him. If somebody tells me they're bilingual, Albert Schweitzer would say, I ask them to say what language they count their change in when they give somebody a dollar bill. But he grew up there in Alsace. His father saw to him that he got a very good education. He went to the gymnasium where he studied Greek and Latin. And his father said, do you want to be a minister? And he said, I want to preach, but I want to be a serious theologian as well. Thus he went to study in universities like Berlin and Strasbourg and was an absolutely outstanding student. He immersed himself in the Hebrew and Greek traditions that we have talked about in our course, and the traditions of ancient Rome, became a very good student of the Bible, wrote his dissertation, wrote his second dissertation, which Germans write. They call it their Habilitationsschrift. He wrote that, and that gave him his license to teach, and he became a professor at the University of Strasbourg. A very fine teacher. His students loved him. And he didn't seem like a distant professor to them. He had his meals with them in the cafeteria. His door was always open. They could come in at any time with any problem that they had. He was also a good administrator, and at a very young age, he was made the director of the College for Theology and head of its dormitory. And he was also a very distinguished scholar. And he brought out his first great book, In Quest of the Historical Jesus. And it was an attempt to examine the generation of German theological scholars who had tried to find what was historical about Jesus in the Gospels, to make a kernel of historical truth. But in the course of this, he came to some very different conclusions. And he particularly began to suspect the liberal mentality, the progressive mentality, that underlay so many theological assumptions of his own day. For the Protestant church was saying that Christianity was essentially a religion of not just spiritual, but of material progress. That Christianity could become part of the material world, that Christianity taught it was all right to make lots of money and then to give that money back in the form of philanthropy. And the church had tied itself to material prosperity. And part of this had crept into the study of the Bible in that historical standards were applied to what was essentially a question of faith. The more he studied the historical Jesus, he became convinced that Jesus was a human. He was not divine. He never thought of himself as divine. He thought of himself as a teacher. And his teaching was about the last of days. Eschatology, it is called. And he believed that the kingdom of God was coming. But the more he taught, the more convinced he became that he himself alone, even though he was human, could bring the kingdom of God into being. And that is why he went up into Jerusalem, hurled himself on the wheel of history, as Schweitzer explained it, and there sought by his own death to bring the imminent arrival of God's kingdom on earth. Well, it disturbed many scholars, but instead of openly attacking it, they basically just ignored it. There were very few reviews, and Schweitzer was disappointed, but he continued on with his theology, with his teaching, and with his playing of the organ, because his parents had seen to it that he got a superb musical education. And he was not just a dutiful student. He was a brilliant organist. And he was deeply interested in Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. And he played it with great beauty. And he began to write a book on Bach. And once again, he thought the previous studies had been wrong in that they had underestimated the religious purpose of Bach. I mean, he wrote religious music, and he did it out of a deep spiritual belief. So he published his book on Bach, and it too won a great deal of notice, and this time was very widely reviewed. So here he was, not yet 30, a distinguished teacher, a distinguished scholar, creative scholar, and widely known throughout Europe for his musical ability and his book on Bach. So he was already reaching the pinnacle of academic success. But he had determined in his own mind that at the age of 30, just the same age as Jesus, he would put this all behind him. That all of this meant nothing. The same way that Jesus had called men to be fishers of men, he would go out into the world and devote his life to humanity, not remain locked up in a cloistered academic experience. One day when he was starting to write and there in his dormitory taking care of the students, he just didn't want to face that blank page, and he cast around for something to read, and there on his nightstand was a little magazine of a French missionary society, a Protestant missionary society. And he said, you know, I wish the landlady would stop putting all these magazines. They're just throwing the trash. But he flipped through it a little bit and then found himself reading. And it was about the call for missionaries, medical missionaries, to go out to West Africa, where they had a mission unit, but they needed a doctor. Schweitzer went down to the medical college, part of his university, and said, I'm going to study medicine. But we know you here, Professor. You're a very distinguished theologian. What are you doing? You're going to study medicine? Yes. I'm going to start medicine right now. Well, excuse me, but how are you going to pay for it? Well, I thought I could take courses free. No, you cannot be a professor and take medical courses. You'll have to resign your professorship, and then you'll have no money. So look, go back, teach about theology. You're too old to be a doctor. No. He wrote his mother and said, I'm going to be a doctor. She wrote back and said, are you crazy? Bertie, you cannot be a doctor. You're a minister, a very good one, and he was a very successful preacher, and you are a professor. And in Germany in those days, a professor actually had some social distinction. And you're a hair professor, and that's what you should stay. No, I am going to be a doctor. And thus he began his medical studies. In those days, you could complete them quickly, and within 3 years, he had his medical degree. So here is this man who put aside all this worldly fame, got his degree, and then said, I am going out to Africa. And he went out to the country we would call Gabon today, in West Africa, and arrived there in 1913 in an absolutely desolate place, and said, I will build a hospital here. His funds were extremely limited, but he set about building a hospital. The local people helped him, and he began to treat their illnesses. He had married, and he brought his wife, Helen, with him, and there they labored side by side, at first just by themselves, then with a nurse or two, bringing medical help to those who so desperately needed it. He no longer believed, he said, in a personal God, and he would use the term God only when describing historical religions. For him, God was the whole human spirit. And here, like the Jesus he so admired, the human teacher, he had put away the opportunity and safety of scholarship to dedicate himself to humanity. And there he labored. And there he was in 1914 when he received the word that war had broken out in Europe. And all the hopes for progress, all the liberal views that the world was marching towards ever greater peace and prosperity were dashed. And it came to Africa, where they showed up one day a French official and said, Dr. Schweitzer, you are a German national. You carry a German passport. Well, that's right, but I'm working here, working on behalf of France and a French missionary society. Doesn't matter. You're a German national. We have orders to inter all Germans. Let me work here. So they did for 2 more years, but under very close supervision. And then one day they arrived and said, you have got to be deported. It was 1917. Dangerous time. The French army had mutinied. The war seemed lost. And so the bureaucrats said, aha, there's one German there in West Africa. We got to bring him to an internment camp. But this is insane. I am the only medical doctor here. It doesn't matter. Are you going to cause trouble? No. So they went back and were interned there in the Pyrenees. Quite an unpleasant experience. Then they moved to the south of France. It was a little calmer and quieter. He could continue his studies, but he was cut off from all the work that meant something to him. And he knew that in his absence, the hospital was going to complete ruin. And the people he so loved had no one to help them. But he was determined to return. See? Determined to return. And he wrote to the Medical Missionary Society and said, I want to return now. But he was a difficult person to deal with. I mean, he was not a bureaucrat. He didn't keep good records. He was always demanding more and more and more money. And moreover, he didn't believe in God. And that was really bad for a medical missionary not to believe in God. So they wrote him back letters, basically throwing all of these bureaucratic obstacles in place of his going back. And they're masterpieces of the bureaucrat dealing with a truly creative and good person. The bureaucrat simply cannot understand creativity or goodness. Both are highly suspect, and Schweitzer was very suspect. But he also had a deep, entrenched stubbornness, and he would not give up. And every time they raised some sort of objection, he came back with a counterproposal until finally he wore them down. In the meantime, he had earned a lot of money for his beloved hospital by giving organ recitals and lecturing all over Europe, so he had become too famous not to allow to go back. And he could fund a great deal of the hospital work himself out of the money that he earned from his organ playing, his recitals, and his lectures. So back he went with his beloved wife, and they started all over again, rebuilding that hospital. But he had come to a spiritual awakening during these years. It had come to him the first time, he said, in 1915, while he was still in Africa, and he was pondering the meaning of this terrible war. Why had Europe, with all its culture, its wealth, its technology, why was it engaged in the most primitive of all human activities, slaughter? And as he was going up the river on a medical journey, he was going upriver to treat the female missionary who was too weak to come to his hospital. As he was going upriver, he saw a herd of hippopotami come out of the water at sunset. And there was the glory of the sunset and these great, curious-looking beasts coming out of the water. Why had God made a hippopotamus? What purpose does a hippopotamus serve? But God had made it. The spirit of the universe had made it. Life had made the hippopotamus. And Schweitzer came to the word that he had been searching for, reverence for life. Ehrfurcht vor dem Leben in German, a reverence and awe before all living creatures. And that was what was missing from the world, that every living creature had a purpose. And man had absolutely forgotten this in his search for dominance. Reverence for life. And Schweitzer decided to devote his life to this reverence for life. He was already living it by treating people, by putting away books and coming out to help people. But he wanted to infuse the whole of humanity with an understanding that every living creature has the right to exist. He did not become a vegetarian, and he understood that humans took animal life to live. But it never should be taken lightly. It should always be approached with awe. Even the baking of bread out of grain should be approached with awe. And that the technology of man, instead of liberating man, was making humans the slave of technology. And in that course of technology, destroying more and more of the whole of the environment. He already saw it in Africa. He saw it every time he went back to Europe. The environment being destroyed because no one had any reverence for it. And he proposed this in his books like Civilization and Ethics. There have been earlier understandings of this reverence for life. Buddhism, the teachings of Hinduism. But they are approaches that step back from an affirmation of life. They withdraw into the interior. We want to step forward into life, to affirm that we have a purpose, that we must live an active life, engage deeply, and yet at the same time revere all life. And the world was drawn to Schweitzer. Coming out of the misery of the First World War, he seemed to be one person that was actually doing good. And people came to his hospital there in the late 20s and 30s as though they were coming to a shrine. People would offer to simply work there for free. And large donations began to pour in. Foundations began to give him a great deal of money. But he continued to lecture to the Europeans. You are going right back where you were in 1914. You have learned nothing. His He did not despise technology, but he believed you had to control it. And he had very small ways of doing it, but he always wrote his letters by hand. People kept sending him typewriters. He wouldn't use a typewriter. He wrote it out by hand, even though he had terrible writer's cramp. But this was one of his little signs that you didn't need all that technology. Another was that a foundation offered to buy him a great motorboat. He kept this dugout canoe. It got you where you were going just as well without all the pollution and noise of a motorboat. And so he continued his toil, and sure enough, Europe plunged itself into another great war. But this time he could continue his work all through this war, and just as he had told, technology made the terrible slaughter of the death camps all the more accessible. And despite all the news broadcasts, despite all the news reels, the world sat by silently while 6 million people were killed, using the most modern technology to do it. But finally the war came to an end. But Schweitzer looked with dread upon the explosion of the atomic bomb. Here was the hatred and contempt for life taken to an extreme, that you could blow up the whole world. And instead of learning from it, the scientists had decided to split the tiniest particle in order to create more energy and more technology, without understanding that human nature never changes. He entered into a correspondence with Albert Einstein. Einstein admired him tremendously, and Einstein understood, as he once said, that creative spirits invariably arouse the hatred and opposition of mediocrities. So they began to correspond. And Albert Einstein asked Schweitzer if he would lend his great voice to the protest against the development of further atomic weapons. And Schweitzer wrote back and said, "I like to stay out of politics, and this is a very political issue. But I see that the case is too important." And he wrote open letters to the newspapers about the madness of a race to develop more atomic bombs. But this was at the very height of the Cold War, late 40s. And the United States saw itself involved in a desperate life and death struggle against the evil of communism. And we had to have the atomic bomb. And of course, once we had it, the Soviets had to have it too, didn't they? That's what they decided, and they got it. And the two great powers, instead of coming together in a peace and harmony, were poised to destroy each other. And in the American government, it was regarded that those who took the side of a peaceful solution to the atomic question, those who spoke out against the atomic bomb, like the English philosopher Bertrand Russell, who said it's better to be red than dead, these were active agents of the international communist conspiracy. And so Albert Schweitzer became not just suspect, but in a way persecuted by the FBI and the CIA. And they kept a huge dossier on him. And the foundations began to write to him and say, you know, every time we send you a check, we have the FBI in here investigating us. And we are looked upon as lending support to anti-American activities. So please, Dr. Schweitzer, stop making these speeches, stop writing these articles about the atomic bomb. Well, now what would happen today? You have foundation money, and they gently urge you not to make these statements. Most people would find comfort in the idea that their work of their hospital had to go on, and they would gently put this aside. After all, he didn't like politics, but he kept on. He kept on writing, and the money dried up. But he won the Nobel Prize, and all that money, it wasn't great in those days, about $36,000, he put to use in his hospital, putting a roof on the huts that people lived in where they had just had thatched roofs, getting more doctors until he had 3 doctors and 5 nurses to work there with him. And still they came to see him. See this man of goodness. And they would come and look at him. He always wore the same shirt and the same pair of pants. His wife kept trying to get him new ones, but he wouldn't. And the pants would get frayed at the legs. And his wife would have to cut them off and sew them up. And so they came almost to his knee by this time. And his shirt was all patched, so much you couldn't tell where the patches began and the real shirt had once been. And he had this battered hat, and he wore it everywhere. Well, no, simplicity. You didn't need all this technology. You didn't need all these new clothes. You think of people today, maybe foundation officers who wear very fancy $3,000 suits and fancy ties and fly first class. Not Schweitzer, still going upriver in that dugout canoe, battered hat. One day his wife secretly bought him a new hat and put it on the hat stand. He put it on absentmindedly and went out and came back and said, "Where is my hat? I don't want a new hat. I want that hat." He had one tie, a little black clip-on bow tie, tattered and stained by now, but put it on 1 minute before he gave a lecture and took it off 1 minute after. But he had his bow tie on during it. And he came to the United States and was a tremendous success, playing the organ and giving speeches. And not even fears that they might be tainted with communism kept the audiences from turning out to see Schweitzer and to hear his lectures on the destruction that mankind was bringing upon himself, or on the goodness that was done there in that simple hospital. The day always began the same, up early as soon as it got light, then working until 12:30, then a short meal, then playing his organ, getting rest, because he understood how dangerous the tropical climate was, and then the work continuing until night came, and then it stopped immediately because of the danger of malarial mosquitoes. And day after day, the work went on as he got older and older, into his 70s and on into his 80s, this living testimony to goodness. Then one day, he announced that he would stop supervising the hospital as a whole. He would play an administrative role only in minor positions, but he would keep on seeing the patients. And then his heart finally gave out. He was laid to rest there in his beloved hospital, there in West Africa, 1965. His wife had gone before him, and the world generally mourned a great and good man. But it is most interesting. Today we don't want good people. And the press began, even while he was alive, to try to pull him down. And newspaper people came out to West Africa just looking for flaws in this man of good. And they wrote articles that did him much harm in terms of donations, but never touched his spirit, saying that he was out of touch, that the hospital wasn't run very well, that it wasn't up to European standards. And he would bring doctors out to examine it, and they said it's better than any hospital in the whole area. Dr. Schweitzer sees patients on a regular basis. He is absolutely beloved by the local people. And so the world couldn't have a truly good man, but how right was he? He told us that technology would become our master. And every time I see people walking out of a lecture, the first thing they do is reach into their pockets and pull out a cell phone, a BlackBerry, to text message. So tied are they to that technology, such a slave of that technology. He told us that our destruction of the environment would come back to us. And today, I tell you, later generations will blame us most for one thing: our failure to take steps to save the environment. He would not have been surprised at all by global warming and all the disasters that might loom before us. And he would have said, it all comes because you still refuse to revere life. Animals have just the same rights as you do. To experiment on them is wrong. To inflict suffering on them is wrong. You deny your very humanity by inflicting pain on other creatures. And he said, you have learned nothing. Children still starve to death in Africa. And with all your technology, you refuse to send the food and to make the arrangements that would keep them alive. And so, Schweitzer, this unconquerable spirit still speaks to us.